All right, welcome to our podcast, Propaganda by the Moral Economy. This is the fourth episode of the third season of our podcast. And by way of introduction, I would like to talk a little bit about our name, Propaganda. We chose the name Propaganda because our idea is to cut through the propaganda that is fed to us by the mainstream media and to offer an alternative source of information for you, the listener.
Alternative propaganda, man.
An alternative propaganda.
We're disseminating propaganda here.
Yes.
I want to make that clear.
We're
disseminating propaganda.
Yes, propaganda that's better than
their propaganda.
Than your run-of-the-mill propaganda.
Yeah.
So, yes.
This
Good.
is well-informed, peer-reviewed.
Peer-reviewed propaganda. We're peers
propaganda.
and we review it.
Yeah. All right.
So, okay, there's a quick structure thing. We start with the global political situation where we talk a little bit about the headlines. We then move into a analysis of the headlines. And then we have a topic today.
CIA.
Oh, yeah,
the
current issue analysis, which is the second analysis that we do. And Navaz will be doing that for us tonight.
And then after that, we will be presenting this week's moral.
And that's it. So let's get started. I'll start. Good. So the first headline I have is the Washington Post blacklists independent media. So you may have seen this. As concerns about fake news mount, the Washington Post has recently published an article accusing a number of independent media sources of being mouthpieces for Russian propaganda. The allegations are alarmist and have yet to be verified by legitimate sources. This is another example of anti-Russian scare tactics being used to the political advantage of Democratic Party elites. Also, Fidel Castro dies at 90. On Friday, November 25th, Fidel Castro died at the age of 90. He is considered to be a dictator and a revolutionary, and none doubt the significance of his legacy.
Moving on. Standing Rock protesters face evacuation orders. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has ordered the closure of the main Dakota Access Pipeline protest encampment of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe by December 5th. The Corps of Engineers will supposedly set up a free speech zone south of the Cannonball River. Shortly after the Army Corps statement, North Dakota Governor Jack Dalrymple ordered the thousands of Native American water protectors and environmental and social justice activists to evacuate the encampment, known as s03e04. Nonetheless, there appears to be no plan to forcibly remove the demonstrators. Instead, it seems that North Dakota police will begin to block the supply route for the protest site, preventing all food and building materials from entering the site, an act that can only be described as a siege. This comes as a class action lawsuit was filed against North County Sheriff Kyle Kirchmeier, Mandan Police Chief Jason Ziegler, and Stutzman County Sheriff Chad Kaiser for injuries caused by the use of less than lethal weapons on the demonstrators. On the 20th of November, the weekend before Thanksgiving, militarized police responded violently against an attempt by the demonstrators to remove two burnt-out trucks blocking the highway, shooting rubber bullets and explosive tear gas grenades into the crowd, as well as using water cannons in the below-freezing temperatures. Police justified the use of water cannons in order to put out fires lit by the demonstrators, but the demonstrators respond that the only fires on site were used for cooking, and drone footage clearly shows the water cannons being shot into the crowd. Paramedics on the scene describe concussions and respiratory injuries, and there are cases of demonstrators being hit by rubber bullets in the head and extremities. One demonstrator describes a flashbang grenade exploding into her genitals, while another demonstrator lost functionality to her arm from a similar device. Despite the heavy repression and threat of siege, Standing Rock Sioux Tribal Chairman Dave Archambault said in a statement that the tribe's resolve to protect their water is stronger than ever. Alongside environmental concerns, including the pollution of the Missouri River by the pipeline and the pipeline's contribution to global warming, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and other indigenous groups wish to protect their sovereignty and the sacred sites that the pipeline will destroy. On Thursday, the 24th of November, Standing Rock water protectors held events to mark the Thanksgiving holiday, which many regard as a holiday that whitewashes 500 years of genocide and mistreatment against indigenous peoples by European colonizers. In other news, Trump is the president-elect of the United States of America. It would be irresponsible of us to continue this podcast without mentioning that Donald Trump won the election. Now let's move on to the GPS analysis.
That's right. So I wrote a GPS analysis focusing on Fidel Castro. Although on the topic of Trump, because it just popped into mind, in other headlines, Jill Stein and the Green Party have called for a recount of votes in, where is it, Pennsylvania and 2 other states. Yeah. And so maybe Trump won't be the president. I mean, he will, but you know, that happened. So good. The GPS analysis. Taking a look at Fidel Castro, I think it's important to recognize that you can have complex and justified views about Castro. All too often I find that narratives about controversial people or situations tend toward the black or the white. Either it's all bad or it's all good. As a rule, I believe the truth is rather more complex. And if our goal is to approach the truth, then we should do ourselves the favor of avoiding the black-white trap. For example, Castro was undoubtedly a dictator. His regime was authoritarian and used state violence to squash dissent. But he was also undoubtedly a revolutionary. He consistently supported Cuban sovereignty and self-determination, and he successfully stood up to the U.S.'s hegemonic influence. It is possible to applaud Castro's achievements without becoming an apologist for his transgressions. What I find personally remarkable about the Cuban story is that Cuba is one of the few countries that has remained largely outside U.S.-led post-Soviet globalization efforts. A great mythology has developed around globalization, much of which is, of course, false or misleading. Cuba acts as a foil to a lot of the assumptions people often just accept about globalization. Things like globalization has reduced poverty and hunger worldwide. Now, there's some truth to this, of course, but globalization has also entrenched economic practices, and especially labor practices, that ensure the perpetuation of poverty and hunger long past the point where we can solve them, which was roughly 15 years ago. But let's look at a country that has escaped most of the effects of globalization and compare. Yes, Cuba remains poor, but not more poor than most of globalization's victims. Look at Honduras or Guatemala or Nicaragua. Cuba compares favorably to Central African countries, pretty much all Central African countries. It compares favorably to Bangladesh, and by some metrics, even to India or Brazil. Cuba enjoys high levels of literacy and education, and boasts solid provision of public goods like healthcare. In fact, Cuban doctors go around the world providing healthcare to countries who are unable to provide it for themselves. I think it's important to recognize that Cuba shows that a lot of what is commonly believed about globalization is false. And that, I believe, is a very important and very positive part of Castro's legacy.
Furthermore, let us remember that Cuba was one of the first sites of the European invasion and colonization of the Americas. To look at this history, I turn to the first chapter of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. In it, Bartolomé de las Casas, a 16th century Spanish priest who had participated in the conquest of Cuba, describes the Spanish cruelty in his 2-book History of the Indies. He says, quote, "Endless testimonies proved the mild and pacific temperament of the natives, but our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder, then, if they tried to kill one of us now and then. The admiral, it is true, was blind to all those who came after him, and he was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians." Here a passage from A People's History. Las Casas tells how the Spaniards grew more conceited every day, and after a while refused to walk any distance. They rode the backs of Indians if they were in a hurry, or were carried on hammocks by Indians running in relays. In this case, they also had Indians carry large leaves to shade them from the sun, and others to fan them with goose wings. Total control led to total cruelty. The Spaniards thought nothing of knifing Indians by 10s and 20s, and of cutting slices off them to test the sharpness of their blades. Las Casas tells how two of the so-called Christians met two Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and for fun beheaded the boys. The Indians' attempts to defend themselves failed, and when they ran off into the hills, they were found and killed. So Las Casas reports, they suffered and died in the mines and other labors in desperate silence, knowing not a soul in the world to whom they could turn for help. When he arrived in Hispaniola, the island of today's Haiti and Dominican Republic, in 1508, Las Casas says there were 60,000 people living on this island, including the Indians, so that from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. In light of this history, which is the history of the indigenous peoples across the globe, we don't have to be supporters of Castro to understand the significance of the Cuban Revolution. If we look at globalization, we can understand it as colonization's legacy. The sites of globalization efforts around the world were originally European colonies, and is by and large former colonizers who drive globalization today. Therefore, if globalization has improved the lives of people, we must not only compare across countries, but across time. Arguably, many countries are much better off more now than they were under European rule or the rule of Western-backed monarchies and dictators, but only because colonization first so brutally devastated the indigenous populations across the globe for the sole purpose of European economic gain. Where indigenous populations survived, they were the lowest class of any colony, and today they are still seen as second-class citizens. In the Americas, where indigenous populations didn't survive, Africans replaced them as slave labor, or European peasants were brought over as indentured servants or to pioneer the indigenous land. All these people remained on the bottom rungs of society, and if it weren't for the concerted efforts by ruling classes to stratify people along racial lines, it is likely that indigenous, African, and poor European peoples would have seen their commonality as colonized peoples. It was first when the colonized began to reject colonization that, historically, their lives began to improve. This holds for the Cuban Revolution as well. Forget Castro for a moment. He was only one person. The Cuban Revolution was supported by colonized peoples, and what are the problems of Castro's revolutionary government, which no honest person should deny? The government and the revolution were direct responses to U.S. efforts to control the island. This is why people loved Castro across the world, and why the United States especially hated him. The direction Castro led the country might not have been real social, political, and economic self-determination for the Cuban people, but the beef the U.S. had with Castro was not with his dictatorship, but with the fact that he led Cuba away from U.S. determination. Before I end this week's GPS, I would like to turn back to North Dakota. I remind our listeners now not only that there are still indigenous people in the United States, just as there are all across the Americas, but that they are still fighting for their land and for their rights to self-determination. The United States was a colonizer just as any other, colonizing first the North American continent before turning its eyes on the rest of the world. Now, at Standing Rock, the survivors of their original U.S. colonization are fighting today's U.S.-led globalization. In addition to the one Chell brought up, another one of the myths of globalization is that it is synonymous with social, political, and economic self-determination. It is not, and the Standing Rock water protectors have shown us that. The pipeline threatens us all, but now more than ever we must learn to support all such fights for self-determination, and not merely when we see that they will affect us. If you still somehow didn't understand the term globalization, it already affects us all, but even that is not the reason to support the water protectors. The reason is quite simple. You cannot demand your own freedom of self-determination without demanding it for all, and the best way to do that is to stand together. So, I open up with discussion, and I will just fill in also that it was Stein Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate who's seeking for the recounts, and the states are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
Awesome.
And also, I think her appeal for vote count is also supported by the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
As far as I understand.
Yeah, I mean, the Democratic Party essentially said that they weren't going to call for a recount, but now that somebody else is calling for it, they're on board.
Yeah.
Okay. So that at least shows that it's not going to be an easy ride to the White House.
No, it's not going to be an easy ride, and I think that's we can get back to what we were talking about before. I think that's something we do need to talk about. Like it would be irresponsible of us not to talk about Trump right now, but also not to talk about like the huge implications right now that Trump won without winning the popular vote. For instance,
right. 2 million more for Hillary.
Yeah, and whatever our questions of the Electoral College are, we question it on a daily basis if you're at the Moral Economy. But I mean, this should show more or less how such democracy just does not function.
Yeah. But there's not much that could be done about it in the short term, right?
No,
right.
I
I was reading something that this time with if Trump goes into the White House, they then have a majority in both the houses of the Congress, and this could be, and I think they also have 32 governorships to them. So that means more than 2/3 of the governorships. So if they were to, stick through this, they could go on and introduce amendments to the Constitution, and that would be very historically significant if something like that was to happen.
Well, I mean, actually, there is something that can be done in the short term, and this is what I heard on Democracy Now! Today. Former independent candidate for president, Lawrence Lessig, who is also a legal scholar, has been calling for that the Electoral College vote on their conscience. And before we think that means that the Electoral College will be voting against the people who
voted them in,
had voted them, what he's saying is not that they overturn what people said, but actually that they ignore certain state rules which give the what's it called, the winner take all.
Okay.
To Electoral College. So in some states right now, if the popular vote wins there, then the candidate receives all of the Electoral College votes, which is not proportional as well. So I mean, he's actually making the same right argument of, no, we should be going by popular vote. So that's one thing that could actually happen, and then I don't know.
And that tells you, how it's not just a matter of simple calculus, as a lot of people would like to think democracy, contemporary representative democracy, as that if people, a large number of people vote for somebody, that somebody's going to go in. Now there's also other intricacies involved.
Yeah, there's a lot involved, But I mean to turn back then to Cuba, as well. I mean, there's a lot of intricacies involved there.
I think it's I don't know if you read that, but I think President Obama wrote a very fitting obituary.
No, I didn't read it actually.
No, yeah, he read. I mean, I think that goes on to show you that he went on to be recognized as a person worthy of respect and admiration, despite his let's say antagonistic attitude towards the US. And but again, I think when Shell and you spoke about Cuba's success or Cuba's position when compared to other developing countries, I think we also have to bear in mind the fact that Cuba has been practically under sanctions for the last half a century, right?
Yeah.
I
mean, we didn't mention that.
So that puts up a lot of things against Cuba.
I mean, it's because of the sanctions that it's managed to sort of avoid the influence of globalization. You know, I mean, there has been globalizing influences in Cuba, of course. I mean, they build hotels. They want tourists to come. All of this sort of falls loosely under the heading of globalization. But it's largely due to the U.S. sanctions against Cuba that Cuba hasn't become sort of, you know, like these other countries that have been so heavily affected by globalization, like Honduras, for example.
Yeah, but what do you intend to imply with that? I mean, I see you using globalization in a very negative sense. I mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, we can definitely talk about that. But what I'm trying to say is that with the sanctions, Cuba was also not able to participate in a trade regime, you know, that's effectively run by the United States and institutions that it controls, right?
If I could just jump in here, actually, while I was writing my part of the piece, I was running into this problem of, you know, there's two different ways of looking at globalization. And we've now clearly come across this as well. I mean, you know, on the face of it, no one's against globalization. Like, you know, no one is against, like, as I think I'd put it, you know, this social, political, and economic self-determination, you know, for all people. But also, like, globalization means that people trade with one another. That's
I mean, trade correlates pretty well with peace times.
Yeah, and that was the next point, and that this trade leads to peace. But that's generally not the sense of globalization that we usually talk about when we're criticizing globalization as well. And I think it's more or less up to us to always mention, you know, the two sides of it, because most people really just think of, you know, the one good side that they learn from propaganda. Not us, our propaganda, other propaganda.
The other propaganda.
The other propaganda, the bad propaganda.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there's this other side, and that's why, for instance, I brought in the Standing Rock protests as an effect of globalization. These pipelines are funded by, you know, banks across the world.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that the neoliberal logic to globalization definitely could be questioned, right? Yeah. But we also have to, and this is what I'm going to hint at, I'm not going to talk about it, but I've been reading literature that points out to the fact that, you know, this is not the first wave of globalization that we've ever seen. Globalization in some ways, in very limited ways, of course, not with the development of, you know, modern infrastructure for communication. There has been a tendency of curiosity, and this curiosity has led into all sorts of globalization in terms of culture, in terms of economy, in terms of trade, in terms of learning, in terms of sciences. So I would be a little careful, you know, in using the term globalization. That's right.
But
I do agree with Shell.
I mean, when I say globalization, I'm just using shorthand for you know, this sort of neoliberal, you know, legalistic, you know, trade frameworks that have been developed.
That too, you know, it's neoliberal globalization, or a specific, you know, capitalist neoliberal globalization that we are criticizing. I mean, no one's criticizing, you know, communication with one another, being happy with one another, you know, trade with one another, you know, all these things that, you know, this curiosity, you know, wanting to go to another country having open borders in order to do that, wanting to go study in another country and having, you know, the possibility of doing that. No one's against these things.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, you know, the Communist Manifesto ends with "Workers of the world unite." You know, that's also globalization, right? You know, I mean, if it were to happen, right?
I'm glad you brought the Communist Manifesto into this. I didn't think we were Marxist enough.
Should we move on to our CIA?
Yeah, I think we should take on a quick break, and then we can move on to the CIA.
Okay, let's do it. Yeah.
See you soon.